So hello, everybody. As you probably know from the course description, my name is Dr. Colin Cordner. I am a Carleton alumni. I have taught mostly with the Department of Political Science for a number of years as a contract instructor. I also teach with the Ottawa Cheval Center and with the Spirituality Center here at Carleton. Mainly, these days, I tend to teach Buddhist philosophy and various forms of secular meditation. However, in my graduate student life and my scholarly life, I tend to specialize in classical philosophy, mainly with Plato and Aristotle, and well, with various other philosophers who basically nobody knows unless they know Hungarians and Germans very well. So I'll leave that aside. However, this course in particular is obviously about Aristotle, and we've got a nice room full of people who seem to be interested for one reason or another. And I'm kind of interested in knowing why people are interested in Aristotle, because that's always an interesting discussion. Anybody feel like giving me a short answer as to why they think this course would be of some interest to them? What's your driving interest or need? What actually piques your interest about a topic so ancient and yet so timely?
You hit the nail on the head. It's timely right now, and philosophy in general, and what's happening not only south of the border but worldwide. I'd be interested to know more about philosophy at the beginning.
Yeah, good reason. Any contrary thoughts or opinions?
To say that what little I know, Aristotle seems to be the Greek philosopher that seems to be relevant. 1800s. I understand there's a revival of recently after Aristotle. I guess is how you would call it. He seems to be relevant, whatever the era is.
Yeah, he keeps on coming back with us for some reason. One of my favorite neo-Aristotelian philosophers is an American woman by the name of Martha Nussbaum. You find a lot of her stuff on actually lectures. She's brilliant, actually, quite good. Especially the American Aristotelians tend to speak to, well, basically what I'm going to try to speak to today, which is what it means to have a character in one society, or a general character in one society, which is conducive to democracy, civil deliberation, people being able to talk to each other and make good decisions collectively, and still respect each other. Right? Anybody else have a thought, or what are any other people looking for in this spiel?
Well, I was curious because I wondered, because I don't know a lot about politics of Aristotle, but whether there's something in that can relate to what's going on in our politics.
Yeah.
And how that connects and what we need to learn, because it's not great.
There are some hiccups, to say the least.
Yeah.
That kind of a general feeling as well. It's like how this can actually address what seems to be, for any decent person, common sense, to be issues or challenges which are arising in society.
Just geopolitics.
Yeah.
Just everything.
Well, domestic politics.
That too. Yeah.
I just have a lot of fear right now, and I think that the amount of change that may occur in the next little while may be enormous, and that we may be living in a time of that we'll look back on the rate about this.
Yeah.
So I need some wisdom.
This is more technical in nature, but could I ask people to speak up? It's really hard back to hear anything.
If it's helpful for you at the back as well, can you raise your hands? Well, no, I don't have a microphone, but I can actually repeat or summarize people's questions as much as
It's
possible.
kind of hard to hear back here.
Yeah, so I'll project and I'll repeat.
Thank you.
I guess my reading and or understanding is, I mean, we're dealing in a world now where having a tyrant in place is sort of a norm. And some of the early reading I've read on Greek philosophy and ancient Egyptian philosophy, the concept of being a tyrant took a turn when Aristotle said something, and I just wanted to know if you'd touch on that.
Tyranny in general, yeah. Definitely both Plato and Aristotle dealt extensively with the topic of tyranny.
Good and bad.
Tyranny was coming back into vogue in their day. Yeah, and so something had to be understood very clearly and understand why it would come about. What are the conditions, the positive conditions which bring about the possibility of tyranny in the most abject sense of it.
And not only that, the reaction that the people may have had when it was better to kill a tyrant versus a thief. I mean, those were some of the early thinking that I sort of read.
Yeah. And there's also a nice quip ascribed to Socrates, or somebody you talked to once, which says, everybody hates a tyrant, everybody wants to be a tyrant inside society, which has gone really bad. And so everybody's afraid that some absolutely powerful figure may take over. But in a society in which a particular kind of character is taken over, or a particular kind of way of being is taken over, people secretly kind of are jealous of the idea of having that sort of like power to do whatever you want, be able to get whatever you want. And when enough people like that seem to be the norm in society, it seems to become much easier.
In politics,
In politics, yeah.
The other question I have is, why do we keep going back to tyranny? We have these periods like Reformation, and we have, like even in the 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're all going to be one big happy world. Now we've rotated back towards tyranny again. If you watch that through civilization, it happens over and over and over again. We never learn.
Why do we keep on doing the same mistakes over and over, or a different way?
That's what confounds me is that we're not learning anything 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years of this over and over again. We keep doing the same thing, we're doing it again.
Yeah, good. So hopefully some of what I offer today is going to at least be some openings to thinking through some of these issues, because they're very pertinent issues. And observe, not only is this happening now, but this is something which tends to happen in history. Sometimes the short intervals, sometimes the long intervals. And what does a political philosopher like Aristotle have to say about why that is? And also, because the political philosophy lecture, what could possibly be done to ameliorate the situation? What could possibly be done to prevent that situation, that downward slide? Okay. So thanks everybody. I'm trying a small table like right here where I got my water, that'd be in front of the camera.
have a chair.
That's an excellent idea. We got a chair. One moment. Okay. So to begin at the beginning. One thing to say first off the bat is that the ancients, whatever society you're talking about, Greece, Rome, ancient China, ancient India, any literate society who still have like ancient records, thought radically differently about politics. We have become accustomed to the idea that politics is this sort of like system in which people sort of fight it out in order to sort of acquire the mandate to govern a society for some length of time in a democratic society. So politics is some sort of activity which goes on in a special place where special people fight about who's the most special and can do all the special things, basically. Or as one modern scientist put it, fighting over who gets what, where, and why. So that's kind of what we think about as politics in a sort of situation. For the ancients, and Aristotle in particular is verbose about this, politics is nothing more or at least nothing less than the extension of the ethical, which is already kind of a bizarre thing to hear in modern society. And so we have to go step by step and understand what that is. Before we can understand what Aristotle is saying about politics, we actually have to understand what he's saying about human nature, what it means to be a human being, what it means to live a good life. Because this is all entailed in Aristotle's part. for his deliberations, which is why there are two books, the Ethics and the Politics, which are actually supposed to be read together. And before you read the Politics, you are supposed to read the Ethics. And it'll become apparent why. And so I had to read two books in Aristotle before even starting this one. Consult a few others. So Aristotle starts at the really beginning of the whole thing, saying, what is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of human life? What is it people are actually really underneath the surface trying to get out of their existence? People go after different things. People chase after different goals. But what is it that's animating all these various pursuits? And when you get down to it, Aristotle's assessment, after looking at all the various opinions people have in the society, the society they study, is that no matter what their particular goals are, whether it's wealth, fame, education, good looks in a car, what have you, underneath that, the underlying sort of emotive type of drive or passion is this pursuit of, well, typical translation is happiness, but the actual Greek word, which I prefer to use, at least at the beginning, is eudaimonia. E-U-D-A-I-M-O-N. You want to keep that simple. You can translate that as true happiness, but a slightly better translation would actually be blessedness. So this is not happiness in the sort of like American pursuit of happiness sort of way. It's understood it. Getting a lot of good stuff and have people leave you alone or less. This term eudaimonia, which comes from Greek, has this sense of, well, everybody probably knows the old expression or the old idea of like having a good angel or good guardian spirit guarding you, right? It's something we at least heard about for mythology. So the word daimon here is the Greek word to translate as spirit, and who means good. And so Greeks understood eudaimonia as being the state of having a life which seems to be blessed in some sense. But already, even in English, we can tell it's a slight shift away from the idea of happiness in the sense of pleasure. The Greeks thought that a good life, the life of eudaimonia, true happiness, is not necessarily one in which you get to lay back and locked up as one martini after the other. It's rather this some sort of state of being in which you feel fulfilled, some sort of flourishing in effect in your life, something which goes beyond the momentary realization of temporary goals. It's not just having a nice piece of cake and then looking forward to having another nice piece of cake. There's this sense of a longer term state of affairs. That eudaimonia, blessedness, is not something which comes and goes with your pleasures and your pains, but rather something which persists in spite of all pleasure and pain and different states. The sense that somehow you're growing, deepening, broadening as a being in some way, shape, or form. So this is all connotated in nature. So true happiness, blessedness, in some way, shape, or form, involves this becoming more human, more deeply human. And of course, people in ancient Greece and Rome and everywhere else, same as here, had various ways of going about this chase of blessedness. And of course, the majority of people, most of the time, mistake blessedness as being cake and beer. Not unusual. However, Aristotle argues in the opening pages of the Ethics is that when you want to call it blessedness, it has to be something which is slightly more stable and slightly less transitory and perfect than the pursuit of pleasure, whatever that pleasure might have to be, not how we find. Because pleasures don't last. Pleasures come and go, pains come and go, suffering comes and goes, hardship comes and goes, good times. So, pursuit of something which is just going to come and go, and always trying to escape pain and chase after pleasure is probably not going to make for a stable working life. And for most of us, especially those of us with some amount of experience, we can kind of recognize the wisdom in that argument. We probably did the same thing. We probably had times in our lives in which we were more obsessed with getting good things and avoiding bad things. And eventually realizing how that entire quest is kind of really self-defeating when accepted together. You have your blessings in your life, have your pain in your life. And to a certain extent, it's a little bit random. You don't actually have full control of the situation. You set yourself up almost to be a victim of fortune because you can't control even relationships, let alone whether or not you're going to lottery. So there's this sense that pleasure cannot be the end of life. It cannot be the goal of life. It either can, it's just escaping pain and suffering. Because it doesn't actually work at the very least. And every sensible person has to acknowledge that eventually. So how about social goods? Fame, good reputation, esteem and honors in your society, or your immediate social circle. Well, these as well. They require external supports. Your good reputation depends on other people. The honor you receive from your society depends on other people. And as the example of Socrates, you know, one of the granddaddies of Greek philosophy in general, demonstrates, whether or not you are actually what we conventionally would think of as a good and decent person or not, doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with whether your society is going to honor you or give you good things or give you a good name. You can actually be a pretty rotten person and be honored very highly by your society. You can actually be a very good person and be put to death by your society. Right? And so social goods, in this sense of fame, reputation, good name, yada, 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 these also cannot be basis for blessedness, cannot be the basis for true happiness. So you gotta put that aside. Maybe it might be great to have good reputation, good name. However, Aristotle rejects it as being end goal. Because it, once again, it relies on others. It's not stable. It's subject to fortune, good or bad. And that just doesn't satisfy him. It can't be the basis for flourishing, even if it might be helpful. So he turns to something else, which most people, especially ancient Greeks, could point to or turn to as being something which would be good in itself. Say that good in itself. For the sake of convenience, we'll use the English term virtue. We have the Greek word again because it's helpful to have the Greek and a definition of the Greek. Because once again, it kind of shifts our understanding of what this word means. We bring our own understanding and baggage to that word, virtue. So the Greek word which Aristotle is using is arete. A-R-E-E-E. There's an accent in there. Build up. But arete is a word which going to be really literal in your translation. It has this connotation of excellence. So the excellence of a good bowl that holds milk and water. The excellence of a good cup that holds your coffee. The excellence of a good human being. This excellence, what makes for an excellent human being? These were questions that were very alive in Greek language, Greek culture. And there's certain, once again, there's certain natural goods which people can be born with, which are recognized as being excellent. It's great to be born with a speedy mind. It's great to be born with good looks. It's great to be born into a family with good reputation and good resources. These are all excellent things, right? But still, even though these are kind of something more like natural qualities, they're still very dependent, right? They're still dependent upon the situation of your birth. It's a bit of a lottery. They're also, once again, impermanent, unstable. Yeah. Your family can call you cute, good looks and charm can come and go. They may or may not help you when people you actually want to attract. They might attract people you don't want to attract. So they're a bit of a mixed bag. What are the things though that go into making you a good human being, an excellent human being? And the Greeks recognize that good character is a both excellence. And so this is why Aristotle starts off by writing, or giving us various versions of the book called the Ethics. Because he's very, very interested in this. Because character is a quality of the highest faculty of the psyche, or if you want to be potential soul, the mind, which every human being, which both rules every human being, and which they have the greatest, in a sense, control. Right? Your soul, your mind, your own. You are influenced by your society, you're influenced by your parents, your life, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, your mind is your own, your heart is your own. You can work on your character, control your character in a way which you cannot control anything else in life. And so this seems to be the interesting point at which human beings and flourishing can be put into everyone's hands. At least it's a starting point. Skip ahead a bit. Aristotle ends up delineating between two different kinds of like this kind of categories or virtue of soul. One is the virtues of character, and the other one is virtues of thought. You actually look this up in the book, it'll actually say dialectic thought, but just ignore that. It's a complication. The Greeks had way more words to talk about things than we do, so we actually have to smudge things together a lot in English to explain Greek philosophy. But we have to start at the beginning again. So we have to start by thinking about what it means to have good character for Aristotle and why it's important to have good character. Any guesses? What do people have to think about character in general? What it means? What it means to have it as us. We have character. We have character.
Defines humanity.
Yeah, definitely defines us as human beings. And we can tell the difference between somebody who has good character and bad character, yeah, right? Mostly. Any other thoughts?
Well, other people will trust you.
Other people will trust you.
Trust is really important in some society.
And so it does have something. Character does have like a interesting, say, social political effect. Right? It builds something in society. Good character somehow it resonates with other people and automatically trust you as a person.
Well, and it's a role, like people follow a role model, especially kids growing.
My experience, I take care of a lot of kids will tend to oftentimes tend to gravitate towards that person who seems to be, they don't even know how to say it. We don't know how to say it, but something about them, like you turn towards them. You know, flower turning towards the sun, things like that.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking the definition of character that is being proposed by Aristotle sounds absolute or objective. And yet I'm wondering if there isn't, if whether character is objective in the sense that there are some people who may say person A has great character and 100,000 other people say, no, that person is horrible. So where there's an objectivity here that is being assumed, right?
Yeah. And I'm making it a lot much more clear than Aristotle is. But Aristotle basically said it's a little bit, but there are things you can say about human nature and character, which seem to be more or less universally true. However, exactly where there's a bit of room to translate it back and forth. So it's not like this is moderation, that is not moderation. It's more Aristotelian and more like a spectrum. And it's oftentimes context dependent, right? What's moderate for a certain person in a certain society is not moderate for certain other society. Or courage. Courage is one of the best examples. Because being excessively courageous in certain situations gets yourself and other people killed. Whereas being ineffectively or deficiently courageous gets you in other people killed. So somehow one needs to find the middle way in extremes. Always all choosing character.
But is there, I guess, the thought that comes to mind, is there a limit in terms of defining what a character is?
Definitely. And one of the famous throwaway phrases in Aristotle is that, in particular, in some sciences, especially in science of human things, one should never demand more accuracy and more precision than the subject matter allows. So, math can be pretty precise with their definitions. In human things, by their nature, there's gray, a lot of gray, but still, in a gray without black and white. There's a lot of gray in the middle, but it's not infinite gray everywhere. And maybe hopefully that'll become a little bit more clear. It's like exactly how weakly, but also semi-objective the whole thing is as we go along. Are there any other thoughts or queries or objections? Okay. You get a bit more concrete in this, though, because we're still kind of fairly abstract. Talking about character in a very abstract sort of way, not talking about particular virtues, which Aristotle actually names and dives into these various books. So, some virtues of character which Aristotle rattles off what we do. We'll go to every single one, sort of fun. But these are the most necessary one, I would say, in my opinion. First is moderation or temperance, sometimes called mother of all virtues. Second one, just talked about briefly, is courage. Third one, I'll translate it as practical. Greek is phronesis, which I'll not bother spelling out. There's a very particular Greek word for this. Fourth, which we'll probably talk about, is the fourth fundamental qualities. Oh, actually. Probably heard of this one. Friendship. One of the most important virtues for Aristotle is friendship. We'll give the Greek for this one because it's very important, because Greek has a lot of words that has love. Basically, love. That's something we get modern. So just fun fact, ancient Greek has 5 different verbs which can be translated indiscriminately as love into English, which is extremely confusing trying to read a Greek text. So to rattle them off quickly, you don't really particularly need to know this, but it's interesting. The word from which we get the word charity, in the sense of Christian charity, the word is agape in Greek. And that's considered to be the form of love, which is completely outflowing and completely disinterested in self. So agape is a sense of loving the other for the sake of the good of the other, absolutely no reference point to one's self-interest or even the existence of the self. It's the most supreme, purest form of love. A little bit further down the run, so adjacent at least, is another word which we'll call familiar with in English, eros. but not eros in Freud's sense, eros in the original sense, which is passion. The sort of emotion which drives all scientific and artistic and also conjugal activity. I'll say it that way. But keep it PhD. But if you don't have passion for your science or your art, or for your lover, you probably are not going to pursue them. Eros is this extremely active form of love, in which, on one hand, you're definitely pursuing someone or something, but on the other hand, you don't completely feel in control. Greek poetry is filled with allusions to being victims of Cupid, victims of Eros, because you feel as if you're just struck by something, and whether or not you want to in your rational mind or in your selfishness, you feel compelled to pursue it, to love it. So Eros has this interesting connotation of never not being quite objective, not quite being subjective either. If you don't really find yourself in it, teach yourself in it. Then there's this discipline, which is most interesting to us. The stock, which is philia, which we can eventually translate as friendship. And this is the sense of caring and loving another one for the sake of their own good, whether or not you're getting anything out of it. Your dearest and truest friends, or the people to whom you are the truest friends, are the people you don't expect necessarily to get something out of you care for. Who you genuinely want to get good things, whether or not you also get good things. For whom you are happy, they win the lottery, even if you don't. And it's more spiritual, of course. You cannot twin this. What's different about this, though, is this is expected to be mutual. This is a relationship between peers, right? So Aristotle obviously recognizes that you can have like one-sided friendships. You can have a sense of friendliness towards somebody else who does not necessarily feel the same way about you. He does not consider that to be active friendship. At least not for the sake of his art. He considers that to be goodwill at best, one-sided goodwill. True friendship is a true relationship between two people who mutually esteem each other and mutually desire the good for each other. And this become important because I'll just give it away now. Why this is important is because if one really wants to choose truly the best and goodest for another, necessarily, well, everything we're talking about before, you don't just want a friend to win the lottery and have a good car, get an award, something or other. But you really hope that they actually achieve the things which are most important to flourishing. Once again, bring us back to developing their character, developing their soul, the mind, the hearts. Because you know that is what's going to truly bring them happiness, blessedness. Something which is going to be a foundation for their lives no matter what happens. Right? That's really for friendship in my sense. Leave aside the other two versions of love, but one can obviously guess. The other one is kind of a pseudo love, epithumia, which we can interpret as lust. One-sided desire to consume somebody else or something else. It's consumption, and important to our society. Last but not least, justice. Final virtue of character, which is it's absolutely necessary in order to know how to behave and afford the way of living which actually brings about conversion. So justice, hard to pin down in a very straightforward way. It's not just law, as in following the rules. But being just involves a sense of having a greater vision of the good for oneself and on the others and for one's society. Once again, we're getting back to the virtues. And being both able and willing and experienced enough to tell what to do in a variety of different situations. You know, the main thing I want to get at here is that justice in this conception is not just like about being punitive, about punishing the bad guys, right? Which is our main form of justice in modern society. So we mainly get obsessed with justice in the sense of like putting the bad guys behind bars, making sure the right people get punished. Justice in Aristotle's sense is more about creating an overall, being able to create an overall situation in society and the environment around you, which enables greater flourishing of society. And yes, sometimes that entails punitive measures, arresting criminals and so on and so forth, in order to promote the common good, social harmony, and so on and so forth. But it has a higher purpose of like creating situations in which nobody falls so far down the cracks that having a decent human life is impossible. And also ensuring as much as possible that no human being feels degraded by the situation they find themselves inside in your society, right? So it has a much more expansive, much greater sense of responsibility than couldn't define for justice. Take a moment to give people and give people a moment to maybe pop forward some questions or some comments.
What's the basis for the concept of justice? Where did he come up with the idea that there's justice?
That there is justice to people. Well, there's a
So
different ways of answering
did he
that.
travel? Did he go somewhere to see there was injustice, or is he just came up with the fact that, you know, I'm living and this person is good and this guy's bad, so we need justice? And just trying to,
Yeah.
What's the thinking behind it?
Well, there's two different ways to approach it, even from within Aristotle. Aristotle himself approached it two different ways. In these books, he mainly deals like a scientist, it's kind of the basis of science in general, with empirical facts, what's actually going on in a variety of societies. Aristotle, in his school of philosophy, spent many years studying constitutions and societies, a wide variety of Greek cities, a wide variety of different adjacent societies, and so forth, just like reporting exactly, okay, this society has these laws, they have this kind of regime, they have this kind of climate, they have blah, blah, blah. And we get this sort of result as a commonality. People tend to, the society, people tend to be immoderate, dissolute. The society could be very courageous, but they don't think very much. Spartans, especially in their day. And so there's that very empirical thing, and he takes in all the opinions, all the common sense opinions of a wide variety of people, states like classes, castes, cities, and sifts through them and looks for what seems to be universal underneath all the surface opinions. And what he finds is that no matter where you go, there are certain virtues which seem to be esteemed, that people automatically recognize them as somehow being good. They might not have very particularly good ways of explaining why they think they're good, but kind of just recognize. People recognize that it's better to be moderate than distant, right? It's fun to drink a lot when you're young for a certain period of time, but almost everybody grows out of that. Everybody at some point said, wow, hangovers are not fun. Maybe moderation is better, right? It's that basic. He's not thinking that only philosophers and scientists or the Google and have the answer, have good opinions about this. He says every human being has access to this basic level of wisdom experience. and they're put in conversations. Listen, it was really relatively intelligent. And they don't have to like cater to an audience. Okay? It's hard to be moderate when you're around with people. So social pressure is the thing. But if you manage to get people out of that situation and have a conversation, people will say, yeah, it'd be better if I didn't drink as much parties. I recognize that it's better to be courageous and be the person who runs towards fires in the right situation, as opposed to be the person who's confident right away. Or the person who can stand up for what I know to be right, as opposed to the person who can mess their pants in situations. Right? And people, even though they have extremely incoherent ideas or opinions about justice, recognize that justice, in some way, shape, or form, is good. And what he says is that, in spite of the many opinions people have of justice, almost everybody has a take on it, which is somewhat right. My kids, what do my kids say all the time? It's not fair. It's not fair. And there's something to that, right? There's that instinct to say it's not fair. It's that instinct of saying something's not equal. So equality has something to do with justice, but maybe not the whole thing. But we also sometimes, especially when we're sure, say it's not earned. They didn't earn that. So there seems to be an aspect of proportionality and merit involved with justice as well. So people who say it's about merit, people who say it's about equality, they both have something weighty, something to it. And these good but partial opinions have to be taken into account to synthesize them into something which gets you the whole instead of just the parts here and there. So that's basically that. Sifting through opinions and trying to put the parts together into wholes. It's an experiment. It's an experiment, yeah. He's very experimental. Anybody else have a thought about what's going on so far?
Is there in Aristotle mind higher character?
I think so. Other people disagree with this, but I think so. And it seems, my reading of Aristotle is that you have to develop them in some sort of order. He does have a bit of a developmental model, how people develop in some games and stuff. Children, older children, adolescents, adults, right? So there's a philosophy of maturation embedded in all ethics. You shouldn't expect as much from kids or teenagers as you expect from adults. Again, that seems fairly straightforward. Once again, that's just based on empirical evidence that kids maybe have reason in principle, but not in practice, right? However, it's reasonable to expect children of a certain age to develop a certain amount of moderation, ability to like not grab the can off the table and sit down. Really straightforward. And so, in my understanding, my reading of Aristotle, moderation is really starts. And courage is the next stage where it's fairly easy to start building courage, even if you're fairly young. It may take a long time to figure out when to be courageous, not to be courageous. But that takes development of the practical wisdom aspect of life. Knowing when to act, knowing when to refrain, knowing when it's the right time, when it's not the right time. Having foresight, and at least having afterthoughts to reflect upon what's going on. And have like a very honest opinion of yourself, how you perform in the situation. Oh, I thought that was the right thing to say then. Now that I'm reflecting upon it, maybe it wasn't the right thing to say at that particular time. Maybe I should have waited an hour. Maybe I shouldn't have been sent. Maybe I should have waited a day, right? These are all parts of practical wisdom. Right? Knowing what to do, when, how, so forth. And that takes a lot of time, a lot of experience, a lot of screwing up, frankly. Both more like applied wisdom. You maybe don't learn the hard way that much. And justice because they relied upon all this. The ability to be just or be friendly. be a genuine friend of people in the lives of the model. So they developed more slowly. So that's all preamble, really, for the politics. So politics for Aristotle starts off as being at the basis, understanding what it means to have human beings in a society who have character. Good. Skip ahead a little bit, but then we're going to skip back a little bit. It's tie these two books together. This is like a very brief overview of the ethics. Now we're going to do a very brief overview of politics, and then we're going to see why they put together, how they put together, what logic there is behind it. So, in the politics, Aristotle starts off figuring you probably read the first book. Or more to the point, it was actually the first lectures. And these are all lectures, basically, so you guys, everybody knows. Not a good order book. Mainly ordered, but not. And so in Aristotle's politics, he starts by looking at six what's called ideal types, or six basic types of a being that is observed over and over again in societies. 6 types. Okay. And they can be categorized in a couple different ways. There's rule of one person. There's by few people. And there is rule by many. One way of categorizing basic constitutions or basic regime. The other way, simple by good ones and the bad ones. I'll expand upon that, but let's just good and bad. So in the basis of the basic cards. Now, what in Aristotle's view is some way or form on this distinguishes a good society or a good regime from a bad regime? Well, in a good regime, a regime in which friendship and justice are considered to be the norms, not always actualized, but the norms of society. Whoever's in charge, their main concern will be for the common good, right? Whether that's one person in charge, a few people in charge, or many people in charge. The main concern of people in charge, the rulers, will be the common good, everybody, right? And he calls, well, there's no good way of translating it called kingship or true kingship. That's gendered in English, but Greek is not gendered. Those who don't kingship. All those true kings and true queens from the movies and the myths. Righteous King Arthur or Queen Elizabeth, who actually is deeply concerned with the well-being of their society, protecting it, making sure that good things, in the highest sense, blessedness comes to that society and all the citizens and subjects. A few, this is another word which is become a bit contaminated in English, but it's actually aristocracy. Now, in Greek, this word literally means rule of the best, in the sense of people of the highest character and virtue. Obviously, in English, at this point, after the American and French Revolution, we think about aristocracy as just being a bunch of fops who, don't do very much for society, but think a lot out of society. Aristotle would not define that as a aristocracy, find it as something else. So aristocracy is the rule of a few people of excellent character, so excellent meritorious individuals. You call it the meritocracy if you want to. But once again, they govern society for the sake of common good, of ever becoming the best that they possibly can on the situation, wherever they find themselves in life. And under the category of penny, no good English word for it. The Greek term, which you can look up very easily online, comes up a lot in public science literature, is polity. P-O-L-I-T-Y. Yeah, about that. And just once again, it's like many people, or maybe even everybody in that society, has some sort of share in ruling, right? You can take part in office, in high office governance or politics or the judiciary or whatever. And everybody who's in those offices, more or less, the commonsensical range of human failings. At the end of the day, the whole thing is still put together by that desire for the common good, flourishing, or what falling through, so people in the practice that they're degraded, or other things. And then there are bad ones. So what would the bad ones be? Anybody guess? You know what the good is? Yeah, I guess what the bad would be. Okay. That's kind, yeah. But it's in general sense, what would define bad regime in general?
Dictatorship.
Dictator.
Yeah. What is it about the character of a dictator which separates them from a true monarch?
Egotism.
Egotism. Self-interested. Self-interest.
So the Roman sense dictator was.
Yeah. In our modern sense, a dictator is like a tyrant. We use it synonymously. But you're right. In Roman times, the dictator was actually someone who was elected temporarily into office as in an emergency to like fix the problem. And then it would last a very short period of time, a year, usually maximum 2 years sometimes. But yes. So when you find a bad regime, egotism is a good word for it. Self-interest. Narcissism in the most extreme points again. So, how would you define all those things? What they have in common is that wherever that ruler is, whether it's one person, a few people, or many people, they are interested in themselves. Common good is no longer the situation. They are not ruling for the sake of the world. They're not governing for the sake of the government. They're ruling and governing for themselves. And they probably even have their sort of views of what is even good for themselves. Because they think of what's good for themselves as being some different from what's good for everybody else. Now, spoiler, if friendship is one of the highest human virtues, highest human goods, and something all human beings deeply require in life, obviously not being able to be friends with anybody because you don't think about anybody else. It's not actually going to make you happy. However, people who are the bad regimes usually don't recognize this. What's that, tyrants? The rule of one human being who is mostly interested in themselves at the end of the day, and probably has a very distorted view of what's actually good for themselves. Interestingly enough. People use Donald Trump as an example, and no matter where you are in the political spectrum, I have a tendency to believe that Donald Trump is probably not a very happy human being. He probably thinks he's happy as long as he's getting what he wants. Right? Like many people, right? As long as you're getting what you want, you're happy. And if you're not getting what you want, you get on Twitter and you start spewing, right? So the tyrant has power, but the tyrant actually has a very tenuous goal of happiness. Interesting enough. But in spite of that, the way that you try to go about pursue happiness, power, position, honor, getting what they want, creates a certain situation for the rest of us. Go down one notch. Rule of a few people also in self-interest. Aristotle, using the word oligarchy. A handful of people, maybe a very large handful of people, who are basically trying to rule for their own sake. And functionally, empirically, this mainly usually ends up being rule of wealthy people for the sake of wealth acquisition. That's not necessarily always the case. It's not a scientifically determined thing. However, it's an observation that when you have an oligarchy, it's probably the rich people, or a handful of rich people, who are competing over their ability to acquire power and wealth with each other, which oftentimes results in one person getting most, usually ends up with. But nevertheless, even if it's a fairly stable oligarchy, the oligarchs rule the same oligarchs for their own families at the very best. And go down one more notch, and they're controversial thing, but it's happened. This arises just because the way conditions change. But rule of the many for the sake of themselves in Greek is democracy. But if I hit you in the wrong funny bone, there's another word which gets used as well, which is pure Greek, which is not helpful. It's called autocracy, which can be translated as like mob rule. And this is the form which is sometimes summarized the best of the worst, right? In Churchillian sense, right? Democracy might be the worst, maybe a terrible form of politics, but it's the best. That's that we've actually achieved, which is actually an Aristotelian point. That wasn't Churchill. He was basically quoting or paraphrasing Aristotle. And this one's interesting, of course, because in a democracy, everybody in principle has some kind of share in ruling. And people can get into office and get kicked out of office, and they can do jury duty and get finishing jury duty, and so they have a share. Everybody has a share in principle in a well-instituted democracy, in all the offices, all the honors, and have a kick at the can, you would say. So among all the bad regimes, but because in democracy, the access to things is so spread out, the tendency towards egotism or narcissism or self-interest in a democratic society, which is defined as a society in which everybody can share the honors, but everybody's sort of out for themselves. Even in that situation, if everybody acting in their own self-interest, you can end up with a fairly okay situation, right? Probably it's not too unfamiliar to anybody here who have heard about a modern democratic liberal society as being basically about everybody trying to get their own in one way, shape, or form. And that their own may include their family, may include their friends, but somehow that issue of self-interest and interests of people I like are primary, or considered to be primary, and it's considered to be natural. So what makes democracy, as opposed to oligarchy and tyranny, relatively stable and relatively okay regime is just that very fact that nobody has like a clench necessarily on the opposites. That even if common good understood as developing the virtues, developing friendship, and developing, justice is not very clearly established. It's established enough that society can be pretty decent.
Is that why, when you think of successful democracies, you have to have a very strong middle class where everybody gets a share, most people get a reasonable share, and when the middle class shrinks, get the two extremes, then your democracy is not working.
Yes, thank you. You just quoted Aristotle. So if never people back then not hear that, the question about okay, this has something to do with why strong middle class is extremely important in democracy. Yes. Okay. There first. Okay, let's go there first and ask the question. But let's start the opposite end first. So one of the things which can make for a very unstable democracy in Aristotle's observation is a society in which there are terrible extremes. Aristotle's general observation is that extremes in human life are never a good thing, whether they're positive, pleasurable extremes or negative, unpleasant extremes. And one of the things in his perception, and it's a pretty decent perception, I think, that holds true in communal life as well, whether it's communal life in the family or it's communal life of an entire society. Where two extremes that you can have in society. Very, very, very rich people and very, very, very poor people. Now, in that kind of situation, unless you somehow felicitously have a situation in which both those classes of people are terribly virtuous and somehow are looking out for each other, you're probably going to have a lot of conflict. Fairly obvious. At some point, if that minority of extremely wealthy, well-endowed people degrade in terms of their character, they are probably going to treat the poor with contempt. They're probably going to rob them blind whenever they can, out of contempt. And the poor are going to be resentful. They're going to be jealous. And their own character development is going to be formed by the bad example of the wealthy. And what's going to happen? State of undeclared civil war. So the poor and the rich will be, if not in open warfare, which happened often in Aristotle's time, at least in a clandestine warfare of constantly jockeying for revolution, in a sense of changing the game. So the poor are going to try to overthrow the rich, and the rich are going to try to overthrow the poor, one way or the other. Might use legal means, ex-legal means, but it's going to be conflict all the time. What is the way which Aristotle has observed that societies avoid this? The friend in the front has said, a strong middle class. Okay, why would a strong middle class have anything to do with solving this problem? Okay, so basically what this comes down to is that the middle class what's interesting about the middle class is that even if, supposing the worst situation, that nobody has any particularly good character in your society, everybody has basically that self-interest in life or animating their lives. The thing about the middle class is they're not so rich that they naturally, instinctively, reflexively side rich all the time, nor are they so poor that they naturally, instinctively, necessarily side with poor all the time. The middle class can sympathize some of the time with the rich and sympathize some of the time with the poor, right? And so, whereas, for instance, very nitty-gritty sort of way, whereas the poor would really like to tax the hell out of the rich and just make them go away, basically tax them to extinction. And the poor would like to do the same, and so the rich would like to do basically the same to the poor, at least to keep them, set up laws and taxation, keep them down as much as possible, keep their own privileges. Middle class neither wants to pay too many taxes, nor does it want to cut off their own ability to get rich. Right? And so it sets up a very interesting dynamic in a society in which, even in a fairly bad society, where people don't have too much character, the middle class acts as a sort of ballast, which balances out the two extremes. It keeps it more stable. And the bigger your middle class, the more stable you will be in the situation. Middle class doesn't necessarily have to be like remarkably good, but usually because of middle class lifestyle, you still have to work. You still have to do your civic duties. You can't escape your civic duties. You're not rich enough to escape your civic duties, so on and so forth. Just by virtue of being middle class, you probably had to develop some basic virtues, some basic character. You may not be a philosopher, queen, or king, but you're going to be probably a decent person. right? And so the middle class in democracy is extremely important for that reason, because it keeps the tendency towards civil war and social revolution under control. It, not that it goes away, but it gets tempered. Reasonable answer, but thank you for bringing that up.
Where did the concept of class come from?
Concept, I'm going to give you a complete etymology of that. It's definitely before Marx. Marx is just adopted it, but it's just sort of like a common sense observation with Aristotle that there are people who are like this, and there are some people who are like that. It's not necessarily a rigid thing, though in certain societies who have that tendency towards civil conflict, it's probably become rigid. The other thing about the middle class is that if you have it, there's going to be a tendency towards more social mobility.
The other thought I had, and I'm not sure if it's relevant, but why good and bad? Why can't we have something in between?
Well, you do, in actual fact, and reason why this thing is like 250 pages as opposed to 12 pages, because it goes through like all the various intermediate states, right? We're just like doing a very brief overview of like the extremes in order to understand the concepts and where he's going with all this.
So yeah, in the middle would be, what would you define that? That's my question, sir.
Where you'd be sliding from one to the other.
Right.
So there's two different ways in which regimes in Aristotle's mind can logically and or naturally slide from one to the other. This one's the most obvious. Let's start here. How does a kingship become a tyranny? Yeah, get a bad son or daughter. Slide very easily from the other end. That's very simple. How does an aristocracy slide into an oligarchy? Well, the rich just start to get a little bit contemptuous because the wealth is being inherited, and the people getting into the aristocracy are going to stop being people who are actually meritorious. But the second is people who are wealthy and get a good education in society, right? Leave that with education in there as a sort of plans. Going to come back to it for a long. But there's this idea is that in aristocracy, whether you're rich or poor, meritorious people get people who are, that's what I wanted to take away. An oligarchy, it's sort of the bastard image of meritorious. Because in most societies, or many societies, most of the time, the rich look at themselves and look at each other, and look at the poor and think themselves naturally meritorious. It's mistaken oftentimes. They just happen to have good resources. They just happen to have the ability to get a good education in private schools. But the tendency for oligarchs to think that aristocrats repeats itself over and over. People of bad character tend to think they have, right? Either which way, you slide from one to the other. It's fairly logically straightforward. It's very logically straightforward here too, from the polity to democracy. The polity, once again, is just a society which.
I'm gonna say, I don't know what polity is.
Yeah, we'll find a little bit more now. Same question.
Just a quick question, when you were saying that tyrants think that they are good, or I think you said that, and my question was, do tyrants think that they are good, and in what parameter, and how in their mind, how do they see that they are good, if they see that they are good?
Yeah, I'm being a bit flippant about it. But what I have in mind is they really narcissistic tyrants. And yes, on some deeper level, they might be engaging in their activities, their chase of their honor and pleasure and so on and so forth out of a certain sort of internal sense of their own lacking. However, in terms of their presentation and how they hold others in contempt, and oftentimes have to demean others in order to prop themselves up, they at least act as if they think this, even if probably in the dark of the night they think about it. That kind of makes sense.
The only thing that can make sense to me is I remember way back in university days, Ayn Rand had a philosophy, as I recall, that the ultimate sort of good was self-interest,
Mhm.
and that if everybody were self-interested, that would be a better society.
Self-actualization.
Self-actualization, yeah. Aristotle, yeah. Now, we won't go too far on Ayn Rand, but yes, that's definitely not an unfamiliar way of presenting political theory. Ayn Rand was not the first nor the last person to basically hold to that stance. Self-interest in some way, shape, or form, whether it's self-actualization or self-aggrandizement or the pursuit of power, is fairly common in modern philosophy or modern political theory. Timing. So again, I'll try to answer your question. Okay. So the basic answer, with a caveat, is that the difference between this and this, between polity and democracy, is smaller than the difference between this and this and this. So the margins are getting a little bit smaller. And so it's subtler, what the difference between polity and democracy. And it comes down to this distinction between the good being defined, good regimes that's being defined by this concern, this overriding concern for the common good. And the common good as being understood as being the actualization of human flourishing. Not just my own, but everybody else's as well. There's understanding that we're all in the same boat, right? And that my good cannot actually be actualized without your good. There's some level of recognition of sort of interdependence in human society, in which engaging in my workaday world, my political, my social and family life somehow involves other than great people, sometimes self-sense. But that kind of is always in the back of your head, right?
Would socialism be considered a move to the left of democracy towards polity?
Depends on whose socialism. It's like there's so many different types of socialism that you can have to pick your version. But it could be. It could be. Same way as whose version of liberalism, liberal theory. Yeah, some of them like that, some of them like that. It's a little bit wobbly. And it really depends on who you're talking about. Democracy versus polity. So in the polity, if you're reasonably certain that the majority of everybody, top to bottom, recognizes that they're all in the same boat. Okay? The majority and the minorities have some level of mutual respect and have some sort of place in society. And nobody's trying to dominate anybody else. Really basic, right? The people who are rich in the polity, reasonably well off, are not trying to like take over, and nor are the poor trying to despoil rich or middle class or anybody else, right? There's that sense of cohesiveness still. We're not talking about like heaven on earth or anything else of the sort. It's more just basic. Nobody really wants it. It's out to get the other God and to stomp. And democracy, not necessarily that bad. Or autocracy, if you prefer that, it's not necessarily that bad. However, there's a strong tendency for the majority to rule for the sake of the majority, right? It just so happens that the majority usually ends up being poor, perhaps with a middle class. So, but because the majority of people look at each other, there's kind of like a sense that justice is the least equality. There's less of a tendency to be like really overbearing most of the time. But democracies can actually be fairly temperamental toward minorities. And recognize as a danger, right? There's a sense that everybody should be the same, not just equal. So that's something which can happen in democracy, which by definition is absent from polity. Minorities are a little bit more safe here. Whether that minority is the wealthy, rich, or whether it's any kind of like ethnic or religious or any sort of other sort of. Wow, I believe it took up that much time. Yeah. Oh no, that's true. We don't end up for coffee. Okay, good. We got plenty of time. We're safe. Please go ahead.
So I don't know much about utilitarianism, but isn't that the same concept as Aristotle is good? You should be doing the thing that on average benefits the most.
Yeah, so the question is about utilitarianism. So that's similar to what Aristotle was talking about. I'm going to give an unnuanced answer and then basically say no, utilitarianism is not quite what Aristotle has in mind. So utilitarianism is a form of like English political thought, some 19th century, so it's developing from the 19th century. And it's the idea that greatest good for greatest number is the highest total pursuit. But that sounds Aristotelian up to a certain point. The way that the greatest good is defined in early utilitarians is pleasure maximization. Right? And so that does get you a certain ways, and a lot of like good reforms came out of utilitarianism. It became like a dominant philosophy at a certain point. Because it drove people to be more, in Parliament, become more concerned with, public sanitation, for instance, or a renewed interest in public welfare after it had been destroyed in the 19th century, and so on and so forth, because that's a measure of utility in that philosophy, in the sense that maximizing pleasures and mitigating pain as much as possible is the end of politics, the goal of politics. What's lacking, at least in the early utilitarian, so putting things back in later on, start reading. People like John Stuart Mill start reading the classics, is some sense of human flourishing. Okay? So that's when it starts kind of turning a little bit back to what Aristotle. And that's Aristotle's fault. Mainly. Also Plato's. Marcus Aurelius and some other nice people, but the main distinction here is that, again, with Aristotle, you always be interested in human flourishing. Human flourishing is not come about just through pleasure maximization and pain mitigation. Right? There has to be some greater in mind. Thoughts or queries or objections?
I'm just trying to reconcile the definition of democracy and Aristotle described it versus the modern concept. Democracy, I'm wondering if that's the modern concept is closer, although not closer to politics.
Kind of try to answer it this way, or at least give it avenue for thinking about it this way. The people who framed the constitutions of countries like the United States, Canada, or introduced the reforms in British Isles, France, they were well versed in the classics. Or at least people within the circles of power and authority were well versed in classics. So they understood Aristotle instead of a whole bunch of other political philosophers, modern and medieval. And so they recognized from histories, at least, if not from philosophers, histories that democracies like Athens had a slight tendency to go a bit over. For instance, if you ever read the Greek historian Thucydides, you kind of somewhere around the middle of the book, you kind of get the wonderful introduction to one of the first genocides in history, recorded genocides in history, which was voted upon and ratified by the radically democratic Assembly of Athens. Right. So the context was a war with the state of Sparta. There was this kind of semi-neutral island state, Media or Milos, out in the middle of the ocean. They were poor, they couldn't pay tribute to Athens, and so the Athenians decided This is bad. We need to make an example of it very quickly, otherwise other people who are under our hegemony are also going to get ideas about not picking their sugar numbers. That's what they do. All those in favor of depopulating Milo, say aye. Aye. Entire male population gets sold to the sword, and the entire female and child population is sold to slavery to pay for costs. Right? So democracies don't necessarily mean good things happen. Democracies can do very terrible things by majority vote. If their deliberations and their actions are being informed by something other than cool-headed practical wisdom and some other forms of wisdom that we'll look at later. Right? If you're driven by fear, driven by hatred, you're driven by any of the other sort of like, shall we say, negative passions, and you're all doing that state of affairs, you're all in that state of mind, you're probably going to vote together to do something stupidly horrendous. Like depopulate an entire island. Among other things you do. Oh, I should fill in the blanks, so other things you should think or have seen amongst people in the past. Right? I remember where the course was. Thank you, though. That was a important question. Yes. Okay. So how does polity slide into like negative form, say autocracy, democracy? It's when the majority starts ruling for its own sake. But that question actually puts us onto a similar angle, which is when the majority is no longer able to rule wisdom. When the majority is no longer able to rule and be full of wisdom and justice, right? What does it take to be able to rule wisdom and justice if you're a citizen of a nice democratic society or polity? You need to have some of the basic virtues. It's good to be moderate. You can keep your hands off other people's stuff. Okay? At the very least, you should keep your hands off other people's stuff. You should also be able to not follow through on your first impulse. First impulse fear, to freak out, probably not going to result in a wise decision. Assembly. Probably not going to result in a wise decision at the ballot box or anywhere else. Okay? Moderation is extremely important to be able to withhold consent to your impulses and to think for a minute before you do it. You need courage. Who wants to be the one person who disagrees with an assembly of 500 to 600 people, right? Go back about 60 or 70 years before Aristotle wrote these books. Socrates did that. His reward for that was getting put to death, right? So it takes courage, knowing that you're probably going to get in trouble to stand up to the majority. It definitely takes friendship. You have to have that capacity to actually recognize the humanity of other people. And to, at least in theory, be willing to extend friendship to other people, especially if they're different. Especially if they're members of a minority, looks different, speaks different, thinks different, right? Doesn't mean you have to agree or anything, but the ability and the reflex to at least want to extend friendship to other members of society, let alone other people's societies, your own society, your neighbors, those bastards, that requires a capacity to act in friendship, a willingness to act in friendship to others. And friendship is the basis for understanding what justice is. Giving equal things to people in situations where equality is called for, and being able to give special rewards to people in situations where it's merited. Right? Equal things, equal people in equal situations, unequal things to people in unequal situations. And that goes both ways. Maybe the poor need more of a hand up and more support than the rich do. But maybe sending the same check to the rich as the poor doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not particularly just. Equal, but may not be just. Right? At the same time, somebody who has done some sort of meritorious service to society or the Commonwealth probably deserves some sort of public recognition, which is not merited by just every humdrum person. Easily think of common examples. Sometimes unequal rewards are observed, or unequal distribution of honors or material goods are observed. Why are they deserved? Because there's a concern for the common good. And there's concern for friendship. Friendship is being the basis of human society, good human society. Certainly good human society, not just any human society. Is that your answer? The vehicle towards kids. Okay. Okay, I think maybe we're starting to see why there's so much back and forth between these two things and why you need to one on the other. We can definitely go much further and deeper into. Or I just kind of do my own thing in my own way. Does anybody have a way that you'd like to see me draw further? How they'd like me to pursue a particular question or curiosity? No? Okay. So I can add a few more layers. This whole situation is not complicated. This is already way more complicated than modern politics, right? We're sort of see this. But one of the things which has been logically implied by the way this is being presented by Aristotle is that in all these regimes, or any theoretically possible, let alone just purely ideal political social situation, there is an overriding concern for good. And the best possible good for any human being being like a virtue of human flourishing. And that any human society should be able to make that as possible as possible. This is where we start getting into the area of education. Before you even get there, we need to back up a little bit more. We've talked about some of the virtues. But we went to probably the most important obvious in some ways. We can all understand what there. But there are a variety of other virtues of thought, second category, which Aristotle actually thinks are quite important to this whole situation. They actually create the conditions in which the natural human pursuit of flourishing, properly understood, is actually. And it's not just about ideas and Aristotle's state of affairs. It's not just about somebody telling you what you should believe and what you should not believe. That's been tried. That's been tried in especially Western and European societies for a long period of time, just like laying out the dogma of what you should believe and what you should not believe. That should be the same for understanding what the good is. That kind of broke down for a variety of reasons. But Aristotle, interestingly enough, lived long before there was a church. There was Western Christian Church, which at a certain point sort of took over the whole affair of moral education, which then subsequently lost. Aristotle lived in a very pluralistic ancient society in which people had a lot of like weird practices and cults and so on and so forth. And his overriding concern was not to like have a dogma, or he didn't even contemplate having like a cohesive dogma in place where everybody was supposed to believe or not. He was concerned about something deeper, actually. He was concerned with the contemplative. obvious question is, what does Aristotle or the other Greek thinker think? Or how did it define contemplation? What is contemplation per se? Kind of basic handle on what practical wisdom is, knowing what to do, when, how, when not to do. Having foresight, having afterthought, reflect, liberate others, come to some agreement. But what are you agreeing to? How do you know whether what you're agreeing to is actually common? How do you know what you're agreeing to or delivering upon is actually at least a reflection of principle? Whether that principle is justice, principle of love. And the basic answer is that you need to be able to contemplate those things. Because anybody can have an opinion about anything. People have very opinions about justice. But they don't know how to contemplate what justice is, which is why they always fight about it. And so the problem, as far as Aristotle sees it, is you need to have a leader. You need to have people, society, or at least many people in society, will know what it's like, know how to actually contemplate and think through very deep human experiences, and then actually engage in conversation in a way which is not me trying to dominate you, but rather actually seeking out what the thing actually is. We shouldn't be fighting about what justice is and shouting at each other and screaming at each other. You should be able to sit conversations, perhaps several different somebodies at once, and have a conversation, we get heated, but in which, because your overarching goal is to know what the thing is, and starting from the position that maybe, probably, almost certainly, you don't have all the answers, and nobody else does either. That act of being able to sit, be open-minded, and actually talk through deep issues is an act of contemplation, an act of engaging in a common human endeavor to actually understand, discover what the common good is. I think people brought up the concern that, our modern political conversations, such as it is, it's mainly generated by people yelling at each other about things and not hearing each other at all. That's not something that Aristotle was unfamiliar with. But he recognized that there were alternatives. That there had been and could be situations in which human beings were actually able to have those conversations about complicated things, deep things about human experience. And probably coming up with some very interesting answers. Not answers that were conclusive all the time. But answers which were, in a sense, a way forward. A way for the ship to go, which was still steered by stars and not by random things. About how ships should be steered. It's actually looking up, figuring a way forward. And so the contemplative life ends up becoming very, very central in ethics and politics. And Aristotle spends some, but probably not enough time talking about what it would be like to have a system of education in which people can engage in this sort of activity at least a little bit, become familiar with it. You don't have to become philosophers, but no, Aristotle. But also the philosophy is like the contemplative life writ large. That's what he was for. And so Aristotle, for a good amount of time, talks about what education should look like in order to make this ability to contemplate, to reason, to communicate, to talk, to basically meditate together, like be together in a common bond of wanting to know what should be done, what the best thing is to do, whether or not it's going to be personally. In the sine qua non, it's the basic, necessary, and inescapable thing that a good society needs. Now, in monarchy, you at least need one person to do that. And that person should probably be the person wearing the crown. In aristocracy, that should be at least a few people. And in the polity, or really decent democracy, that should be a lot of people should have an education which allows them to be able to contemplate verse and accept that they don't know it all. But that the common good is their common goal, even if they're arguing about exactly what it is at any particular point in time. That sound okay so far?
So is that missing in our society then? I'm listening to you, and I don't know of any body or anywhere that we do that in Canada, the United States. I mean, at one time I might have suggested perhaps a Supreme Court, but I think that's not passe because that's become politicized. So are we missing that? I mean, it's supposed to be very important. But maybe I'm missing it myself, but I can't point to a body that's being done.
It's hard to say, but that's the question, right? That's like the litmus test, I think. That Aristotle gives us. Can we find? It doesn't have to be even like an official deliberative body. It can just be like informal practice in your society. So you could say, yeah, okay, this particular body, Congress or Parliament, is like this one right now. We're yelling at each other on camera. We don't know what's going on when the camera's not on. And oftentimes the camera makes it much worse and focuses on things that are bad. So we make it a skewed perspective. But even if that's the case, what's going on outside those walls? What are people doing in their actual lives? What are we doing as individuals in this room, right? Do we have enough of an instinct to actually be in that state of like common contemplation with another human being who disagrees with us, perhaps? Are most people that we know more or less able to do that most of the time? That's the question. Because we're not officially in aristocracy or an oligarchy. This society defines itself as being somewhere in this line here. And so whether or not somebody over somewhere is doing that deliberation doesn't matter. Versus situation. Everybody in Parliament is a philosopher. And they're able to engage in this conversation at great depth and so come to very reasonable conclusions. But everybody else in society is a jerk. And it's a democratic society. What's going to be the result of that? Is that going to last? That's stable. So, to me, my interpretation is that if society in general is more or less decent and able to engage in these practices, then the society always has hope. Right? Hope for resuscitating itself. Because we are in a society which I think aspires to be democratic or a polity of some sort. And so it's absolutely necessary that we both be able to be decent with each other. Especially different.
Bit more positive than
I don't know about that, but
So I see examples of this happening in our own parliamentary system, like on the federal level, we have Senate subcommittees. They get together and they invite people, speakers to come in from all walks of life with different points of view. So they're doing this contemplative like discussion, and also in municipal councils, city councils, where the mayor has no more power than the rest of the council. So they're also doing that, and they invited expert witnesses, and public has the same things too. So I think that's happening.
I think we do make efforts, right? Since we're not so totally out to lunch that we're saying it's going to be free for all. Whoever gives loudest, get it, right? And go back to the earlier question, which was brought up about our kind of modern constitution that I mentioned, is that the people who were trying to bring up constitutions, whatever the personal foibles and failings, which were many times, there was understanding and recognition of some amount of wisdom coming from Greeks and Romans, that certain laws and structures and institutions have to be put in place to keep the worst proclivities of democracy from bursting out seams. Which is why we have rules of procedure, we have parliamentary customs, we have Senate subcommittees and House of Commons subcommittees and so on and so forth. We set ourselves up to in recognition of the fact that we're not perfect and we're going to do stupid things. It sets up either formal checks and balances or informal checks and balances. Because, in Aristotle's terms, the rule of law is almost always better than. As human beings, even if they aspire to the good, do kind of mess up some of the things. Fortunately, sometimes it's proof. So the rule of law is extremely important. Caveat, of course, is that rule of law, or even the aspiration for rule of law, starts getting overthrown. That's when democracy really starts sliding further and further. Same as it does. This is completely lawless, utterly. This tends towards lawlessness because the oligarchs fighting each other. And democracy, when the people starts feeling its strength and its own whims more strongly than its attachment to the laws or the customs of its own society, let alone that ethical life. That's when islands get to popular.
We do say we are sliding right now. In the sense of the wrong way in democracy, away from the rule of law, to something more chaotic.
I would say, in comparison to everything I've read about Athens in its worst times, I'd say it's nowhere near that bad. It got pretty bad ancient times, actually. Not for no reason that Aristotle played some sort of political philosophy. Yeah, I think we definitely have bad moments, so we definitely have maybe very long periods. But my own take it or leave it, it's not what they particular, is that I was actually interestingly impressed by some of the exit conversations after the American election. Even if I think some of the decisions by some of the voters were incredibly imprudent, the reasons that they gave for those decisions were fairly reasonable and intelligent, even if they would say that they were perhaps misinformed or colored by misperceptions. Okay. That's a far different thing than say, oh, my fellow citizen made a bad decision based upon misperceptions, misinformation, as opposed to my fellow citizens are bad people. They're fundamentally stinkers. I think. Not to say it's not a difficult situation. It's not unsalvageable. Our fellow citizens are not unsalvageable. But when we start thinking about them as unsalvageable detritus, that's when things become more luxury. It's probably actually not true. But we're seeing a situation where we think that about them, and then they're naturally going to think that about us.
I think that's the problem, is that we've cornered ourselves into an us and them society. That sort of goes back to this 6 types there. What's missing in his thinking is the fact that you need to have a Z-axis coming out of the board, which looks at ethics. And I think that's what's missing in our thought process and character process.
Yeah. And oftentimes you actually study Aristotle with the science course anywhere. They don't just like skip to the politics. They really shouldn't, because
Should start with the ethics.
They expect to completely take in all the stuff and run through the arguments.
that Aristotle thought certain members of society were incapable of all this, right? So the slaves were an integral part of great society,
Yes.
but they don't factor into any of this because they're incapable of good care.
Yes, thank you. So that comes to the dilemmas and questions concerning Aristotle portion, which I was going to spend a few minutes on. Anybody, unless anybody has something else we want to ask about what we've done so far. Good. So there are some audits in Aristotle, to say the least. And there are a few different ways you can approach those audits. We'll do and what I want to talk about. First point, neither Aristotle nor any other pre-modern figure ever put a system, right? So you can take or leave any chunk of Aristotle or Plato or Aurelius or Epictetus you want to, retain the wisdom and throw out the crap. And it doesn't affect anything else, right? So Aristotle's speculations about astronomy, which presumed a geocentric universe, they don't actually affect in ethics. It's ethical, right? Okay, so you can just throw that out. So you can say that about big chunk of everything Aristotle writes, or Plato or anybody else. So that's a good part. That being said, there's still some weird things which come up in Aristotle's politics. And that is, one was position of women, and the one is his position on slavery. And I go over these things periodically every few years, and it gets weirder every time I do it. So, women. So I'm going to go with position women is actually a thing. I think I've pretty much figured this one out. I think probably wrong, but I think I figured this one out. Aristotle. So there's this like really like jarring sentence or two in I can't remember which book it is offhand. The politics or the ethics in which Aristotle is like talking about like the ethical life and like reason fully actualized is like the highest form of human life. That's what causes most of the flourishing, the best, most blessed life. And there's a throwaway line about men that like was active with children that's potential but not actualized, with women it's not effective. It's like, whoa. With women, reason is not effective. So what the hell is that? Like, so obviously, the obvious thing to do is like, whoa, that's just sexist. That's that kind of just Aristotle. He just had a thing about human females for some reason, way, shape, or form. And that was my take on it for about 10 years. Then I started actually thinking about this. Oh wait, Aristotle doesn't think that the virtues can actually be actualized in society. And what was Greek society, any society at the time? Athens. Extremely patriarchal. The women were deliberately barred from public deliberations. Interesting caveat. Aristotle went to school, university in Plato's academy with women. We know that. We know women were admitted to the academy. Incredibly dangerous thing to do on Plato's projects. Could have gotten them killed. Like, let women in because all of them souls are corrupted. Cool. Fundamentally. As long as they want to engage in philosophy. But Aristotle, why the hell would you think that since the effect of women? That makes sense. He also knew that Socrates, Plato's teacher, named almost every single one of his teachers he names for women. Diotima was a woman. He named his mother, Anabaite, as being the greatest teachers. He named another woman, a woman by the name of Phasia, who was like a rich courtesan, actually, as being one of his favorite people to have conversation with, and considered them his teachers. He can only really name one male teacher in all their main dialogues. So, why would Aristotle say something like that? What does it mean for women's reason to not be effective? It means it can't actually have an impact on society because the society does not allow it. I think. No, it's not that the faculty of reason does not exist in women, that they can ask you to contemplate it, but always exists. However, in patriarchal society, that's oppressed, for lack of a better word, right? And that is suppressed. And actually, in various points, actually talks in very lauding terms about, for instance, in terms of philia, that if you actually want to understand philia deeply, you actually understand that you actually have to understand women, especially mothers. Mothers more naturally develop a full capacity for friendship because they are the human beings who are put in the position of actually having to develop complete care for the good of another being, probably an infant. So their feeling goes way further than most people most of the time. But women are actually the example, people you look to empirically find one of the highest virtues. Virtue underlies justice. Interesting. But that's kind of a takeaway. I still think Aristotle is a little bit sexist, but it's like hard to prove now. Now, the slavery thing, I thought like that's like totally good slavery. So there's another intimate section in politics in which Aristotle out of the blue starts talking about the idea or possibility of there being something like slavery by nature, slaves by nature. In context, again, we know that Plato was not outright, because nothing in Plato was outright. And in various political dialogues written by Plato, slavery is no part. It sort of like quietly disappears from all the best cities. Rather suggestive. And we know that Socrates didn't have any problem talking to people at all. And we also know that even in the overall intellectual culture of Greece at the time, the so-called sophists or intellectuals, at least half of them thought that slavery was purely an invention. It was purely a matter of power. One person in society having power over another is no more justifiable than that. So why does Aristotle even approach the subject? Well, still living in a slave-holding society. Actually, by Aristotle's time, the number of slaves in Greek society has actually on the increase because there are so many fratricidal wars. And every time there's another fratricidal war in which one Greek city tries to depopulate another, usually take half the population to be slaves. The slave market's been getting bigger, not smaller, for many, many years. And will continue to increase all these interests. But still, before you approach the subject, is there any sort of situation in which you can say it's natural for somebody to do? And it's a weird, the whole section is it's once again extremely weird, it's long, and there's like subtleties in it where you can like, wait. Now, my own reading, which is just my own reading, I can't pretend to speak for like the entire commentary tradition on Aristotle, about this, which goes each way. Is that I think Aristotle is actually setting up a situation in which the idea of slavery looks so absurdly remote that it's impossible to justify. Because the way he talks about the natural slave as being the natural master and natural slave as being natural master is basically a psyche or a mind, which have all its necessities like taken care of for them, and the slave as being almost as close as possible as being a body without a psyche or a mind or soul, which makes no sense even in Aristotle's understanding of psyche and body. Right? And somehow they be in a mutual symbiosis, right? So the master needs the slave needs the master. Same way that the psyche, soul needs body, and body needs the soul. Which, if you stop for a moment, that actually sounds pretty damn absurd and impossible. That being said, of course, even by broaching the subject, it gives people like a vehicle to say, yes, there's justification for slavery. Cool. And there's some other sections at the end of the politics, which 2 minutes, but in which he broaches the subject again, where he talks about slavery again in one version of the best possible city. So he talks about the best possible city in various different ways, various points in the book. And so he ends up with a whole bunch of different rounds, which could be the best city. This could be the best possible regime type kingship. If by some happenstance you ended up with one human being who was so superlatively virtuous and reasonable that they so far exceeded everybody else in the population that it made no sense to rule them because they're too much better. We should just hand over the keys. But once again, that's Aristotle says only situation in which that's likely happens in a fairly small society. It's unlikely that you're going to get one person who's better than 30 million altogether, right? That's unlikely. Then 100 people, 1,000 people, maybe. Polity could be the best as well. Not talks about that, it could be the best, but he also says the balancing act to get a polity and not have it slide into something else is difficult. So he doesn't really go into too much strangely enough. And oftentimes talks about democracy being possible, the most practical, because societies over a certain size is like the majority is just going to be very strong. And so the best you can accomplish is actually have a well-educated majority. And that's going to be pretty decent. It's actually a pretty good accomplishment and have a strong middle class. Stabilize it. Middle class should be as big as possible. Nice. Democratic society, strong middle class with good public education. Probably have a good society. Then he goes off on some weird tangent towards the end of the book where he talks about, once again, about the situation, okay, if the contemplative life is the highest life and things of the psyche are better than things of the body, then in some weird theoretical imaginary thought experiment world, you would think of having a society in which there are a whole bunch of different people who are dedicated to contemplative life and leisure and do not have to get sucked down to the necessity of having a job, eating, clothing yourself, doing your laundry. All things you have to do, but you don't really want to do. And then obviously you have that, you have to have a whole bunch of other people doing the shitty jobs. And so he talked about this one variation of the best possible regime where there would be like some tiny citizen population of people completely at leisure. And then all the artisans and the farmers would be slaves. Which once again is what moment, because a few dozen pages earlier in the book, he talks about the farming society as being one of the most stable democratic societies, probably one of the best examples. So one of those kind of like seeming contradictions, which I think gets explained away as being a thought experiment you can take too seriously. But again, so I've exhausted our time, but I'm happy to actually talk further if anybody wants to ask me a question. I also don't want to make anybody pay.
Exactly. Do you have any half-decent reference that looks at how his thinking was influenced or could have influenced other societies?
It's actually a pretty vast subject. So I mean, when Aristotle got rediscovered in the West in particular, by the Arabic Alphabetes back in 11th, 12th century, it had a huge impact on Christianity. Huge impact. So Aristotle became the philosopher of Christendom for many centuries. He still is the major philosopher of the Catholic Church. Thomas Aquinas, other Christian leaders had a big impact on Muslim society too. Aristotle and Plato were taken up by Arabs and Persians intellectually very early on and became very influential upon traditions within societies. So you can look it up and you'll get more stuff than you focus.
That's what retirement's for. Thank you.
We need to do it 6 in a while. I don't know if you have
I have markers. Give them that. I also turn this. Oh.